So I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposed liquids rule that's out right now and the preliminary regulatory impact analysis. But before I get into the details of that rule, I want to say a couple of things just sort of generally. So the first is, and John said this, but I think it's really important to reiterate, pipeline safety is such an interesting regulatory world because you have the only mandatory cost justification standard in the environmental health and safety realm. I cannot tell you how amazing that is to me, right? And that drives, I think, a lot of thinking about regulation in this context in a way that it simply doesn't in another context. Everybody has to do cost-benefit analysis through OMB, through OIRA, right? Certainly, I don't want to minimize that process or how it influences regulation. But I think what's interesting about what's happening here is that's not just an information device. So one of the common reasons for having cost-benefit analysis is as a sort of form of sunshine, right? A way to say, this is what this agency is doing, they're doing it under their statutory authority, and here's what it means. So at the end of the day, the agency has to follow its statutory authority. So if you are the EPA and you're regulating under the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Air Act tells you to protect the human health with a margin of safety, right? That's what you do under your rule, but you also show that that might have costs. And in fact, it does, of course, in a cost-benefit analysis. So that's been the traditional understanding of what cost-benefit analysis does through our system. It's a transparency device. Now you have to wonder, right? I mean, you look at this document, 86 pages. I'm sure you've all read it very carefully. Whether this acts as an informational device at all, I would argue that it doesn't really for most people. I mean, it's very technical. It's very hard to understand. And if you're looking for wisdom about pipeline safety, I think there are a lot of places to look. This is probably not one of them. But all that said, right, here we have a cost-benefit analysis through OMB, through OIRA, that actually determines the content of the standard, that is, determines how stringent the regulation is going to be. And I think that's what makes this interesting and what makes it really difficult. So here now we're getting at this question of what's the sort of best thing for social welfare, right? What's efficiency, but we're doing it through this very particular mode of counting up costs, counting up benefits, right? Trying to figure out what our net benefits are. With that introduction, so the proposed liquids rule, I'm pretty sure you all know about this, right? But just to break down the categories, we have information gathering. We've got these actions that occur after natural disasters and extreme weather events. We've got these non-HCA pipeline requirements, periodic assessments, use of leak detection systems. We have repair, modifications to the repair criteria in terms of deadlines. And then finally, we've got these requirements within the IM program that relate to making the pipelines piggable and clarifying the planning process. So that's the bulk of the rule. So what are the costs according to this cost-benefit analysis? At the end of the day, right, there are two costs. So either it's a labor cost or it's another cost of equipment and material. So what we're getting at here are compliance costs. Now, in the general cost-benefit literature, there can be a whole set of costs that relate to what happens when you affect the economy and sort of social welfare. But traditionally, compliance costs are what are measured. And a lot of what I want to say is cost-benefit analysis is about what you can measure. So what you can measure drives the system. So what you can measure here is compliance costs. And so you measure those. All right, so here I've broken down the categories, so labor costs, and then costs of activities. So actually the way the cost-benefit analysis works, they actually have a separate cost for, say, air patrols, right? Annual cost of air patrols, annual cost of inspection for assessment, retrofitting costs. So I'm just curious, do any of you know what the top category is of costs in this rule? What was it? Repair? It's a close second to inspection costs for assessment for the non-HCA pipelines. In terms of just straight up labor costs for reporting and IM planning, right, that's without any of the other pieces to it. Those are smaller. Air patrol is fairly small. Retrofitting costs, fairly small. So why are some of these costs small? They're small because PHMSA is saying in this particular cost-benefit analysis that the industry is already doing a lot of what they are suggesting they can put into rule. So one of I think the conclusions of this type of cost-benefit analysis is it's easier to show net benefits if the costs are low. One way to get at costs are low is what people are already doing, except for a small sort of cadre of actors, right? So this is how this works out in the cost-benefit analysis. All right, very long list, but this, I think, makes my point. These are all the benefits, right? So these I pulled from the document. So I'll start first with those that are quantified. These are your standard deaths and injuries, property damage, environmental damage. Sounds like costs, right? But they're avoided costs, so they're benefits. We don't have incidents, therefore we have the benefits of the fact that we don't have those incidents. Those things are monetized. So, for example, there is a number in there for how much a human life is worth, right? How much a particular injury is worth. You count those up and you add them to the property damage and whatever other environmental damage is being reported, and then that's the particular numbers you use. But there's this vast world of unquantified benefits, and they're recognized in the RIA, but they're not quantified, and so they end up in sort of paragraphs at the end of the analyses, and I think that really also is somewhat problematic to the system. That is, if you believe that these benefits exist, they're real benefits, they're just not quantified benefits. It's hard to know how to put them into this, what's basically a spreadsheet, right, between two numbers. So what are they? They're things like increased regulatory certainty. I think we'd all agree that that's a benefit. It's really hard to measure what that actually would be in numbers, right? Or increased situational awareness, similar thing, or other costs of incidents that are not reported. So these are things like litigation, less severe injuries, so that those aren't reported. Evacuations, long-term health consequences, another big one, really hard to monetize. Public confidence, really, really important, right? And again, almost impossible to monetize, I think. I'm not an economist, but I think it'd be difficult. So other things, the benefits of having information about requirements out there for the public, a level playing field, and energy security, right? These are the reasons we care about pipelines. They're also not monetizable or not within the system that we're using now. All right, so just to give you on the benefits side, so these are all, by the way, undiscounted numbers. So I'll talk in a moment about discounting, but these are before discounting. So this is, I added up the numbers in the RIA, and we get to 45 million to 61 million undiscounted. Everything else, we don't know. They're there, right? But we just don't know the numbers. So by my numbers, and again, we're not doing discounting here, we end up with net benefits of close to 20 million for the rule. All right, so now I want to talk about discounting. One of the big criticisms of cost-benefit analysis is how it treats costs and benefits over time. So how we treat costs and benefits over time is we discount them using a discount rate that varies from 3 to 7%. And the theory is we want that money now and not later. So we value that less over time. What that means, I think, if you put it crudely, right, is that somebody's death in 10 years is worth less to us than their death now. I mean, that's the system, that's the accounting system. So that's been a big criticism, and I think it's a hard one. The other one is, how do we monetize deaths and injuries? We do it all the time in litigation. I mean, when we have somebody die and we have a damages action, we got to figure out how much their life is worth. I think that is how the law works, but there's some question about whether we should be monetizing in this particular way and averaging for this kind of purpose. And so there's an article out there that talks about sort of that life is priceless and that we shouldn't be adding costs to it through this process. One really common criticism, one I've already alluded to, is we focus on costs. They're easier to calculate. So, those of you in the industry, you have information on costs. You know what your clerk at X level, right, per hour is paid, and you can calculate those numbers out. And I'm sure you will for this RIA. But that doesn't help us. I mean, that helps one side of the equation, right? It doesn't really help the other side, the benefit side. And then on quantification side, we really focus on those quantifiable benefits, very small package of the total benefits. All right, so here's where I think we end up going with this system. I think we establish standards that have low costs of regulation because they're easier to get through the system. So what are these low costs? They're industry standards. They're standards that most firms are already following, and I think that's a lot of what's in this RIA. They're delayed requirements, both because we assume that technology might change, right? Things might get less expensive over time, and it's done sort of formalistically, right, through this discounting. So we actually discount the cost of something happening 20 years from now substantially. I mean, think about 7% over 20 years, right? It's a substantial discount. And so those costs are a lot different than the numbers that we would have undiscounted. And we have exceptions if things are too expensive or not feasible. These are all ways to reduce costs. What about the benefits side, right? We focus on standards that can be justified by the quantified benefits. And here we're talking about incidents, historical incidents, and the particular numbers that come along with those incidents. So fatalities, injuries, reported property damage. You might think of that as like a bucket of benefits. That's all we have as a bucket, right? So you can't use up too much on this one standard because you might need to use it over here on this other standard. And so it sort of changes the incentives, right, in strange ways in terms of thinking about what these standards are supposed to do. We also have to make assumptions, and I'm not saying these aren't correct assumptions, but I'm just saying somebody has to make assumptions about how effective these particular standards are. So in here, it's anywhere from 10 to 40% effective. Hard to know, right? Because this is a level of uncertainty that we just can't quite master coming out of historical data on a standard that we're now proposing. And then I think another way in which the incentives work here is if you have something else out there that's more expensive and you're replacing it with something cheaper, this actually works out on the benefits side. So for example, there's something in here about replacing, I think it's hydro testing with ILI, and that hydro testing is deemed more expensive, so it's actually a benefit to have ILI. So I think two things happen in this context, right? We have standards that have fewer costs. We also have standards that have fewer benefits. So some of the standards in here, for example, the information standards, really hard to figure out what the benefits of those standards are. So what ends up happening is not that much in costs, we don't think, to gather this information, not a lot in benefits. So what the rule ends up looking like is not a big deal, when it actually really is a big deal, but the sort of costs and benefits are low. And then I think the other thing that happens is we just have less stringent standards because, again, we're only counting a portion of what's happening here. We're not looking at those quantified benefits, and because of the discounting and the other things I talked about. All right, so that's my particular perspective, and I will hand it over to Bill.